I'm kind of known in the field for questioning things. Why do we think this way? Why do we think this is effective response to climate change? Why do we think that we need to adapt? Or why do we think about the world the way we do? So a lot of the research I do is trying to help people to rethink the future. What does it mean to live and think and imagine a changing climate?
What is something that you feel is important for us to highlight when it comes to, where does climate mitigation end and where does climate adaptation start?
That's a very loaded question to a scientist.
Let's dissect it.
Yeah. Well, most of the conversations we have around climate change, it is around reducing emissions, because obviously the emissions are the problem why we have climate change in the first place. But a lot of the conversations in the recent years in particular is really understanding that there is, mitigations of reducing emissions, but then the other side of it is like some of the impacts of climate change are already here. So we are seeing increasing number of storms, they're increasing in intensity and frequency heat waves, it's just global temperature. So how do we start adapting to those impacts? So the adaptation conversation is becoming, I think, more and more relevant now that people are seeing the impacts and are starting to think, well, if I live in an area where my garage or my basement is going to flood 5 times a year, what am I going to do? And so those kind of, experiences, but also thinking about the future. So that's very much what adaptation is for. It's like, how do we make better decisions today that can keep us safer in the future?
Climate adaptation, to me, I feel like is sort of the only real option at this point. I mean, obviously mitigation as far as cutting CO2 emissions and trying to think ecosystems first and sort of circular systems first, moving away from the sort of consumption only, and then we create all this waste and sort of forget about it. All of that, to me, sort of plays into the idea of climate adaptation. But the thing I see the most, I would say, in the field is little things that people don't think about. Like everybody, I think, at this point is aware of plastic and microplastics and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and that sort of thing. But I think there's a lot of smaller things where it's like, lawns and stuff in the US especially, where they're a monoculture. And so you're seeing these huge changes in insect populations. And just things like that, where little things we do day to day that don't necessarily, you don't necessarily think of as like this big climate impacting thing, but they add up over time. I guess kind of a question from that would be what is the balancing act between net zero versus, just having more native plants in your yard?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm always when people say, well, what is this against that? I'm always like, well, I can be both. But with adaptation, it's interesting because it is very context specific. So we talk about, one person's or community's adaptation is not going to look like, look similar. But with your example of the grass, so I've seen a lot of people posting about, we need to have like lawns that have all types of flowers and high grass, so the insects and can live there. And I would love to have, like in my house, I would love to have this kind of, wild patch in front of my house. But then one of my Australian friends said, well, you'll get snakes. So like we have to, apparently, like that's one of the reasons why we have to keep the grass short. And I'm like, but I wanted the wildflower field. And she's like, no, that will attract a lot of snakes and your neighbor's not going to be happy. But I think it is those kind of small changes. And I think there are a lot of, when we talk about how do we scale climate action, I think there are these small things that we, like you said, like we've just grown with that. Like we have to always cut the grass. This is what lawn looks like. This is how you water your lawn. But I think there's so many small actions that are based on the culture that if we would change that in the country or in a global scale, we would see mass benefits for ecosystems as well. A lot of the conversation often, I feel like it is very very focused on humans. It's like how, the well-being of humans, but we kind of sometimes forget that we don't live in isolation. Like whatever we do, like we have to think about humans / ecosystems. Like, it is our health and our well-being is so connected to ecosystem services that we don't, because people who grow up in cities, maybe we don't think about that as much. And that's why I love working with some of my Indigenous colleagues on climate adaptation, because their worldview is completely different. They're like, this adaptation action is not separate from nature. It's like we are trying to do something where we respect the environment that's part of us. And that's been, I think, one of the big lessons for me, working with this kind of different cultures and different worldviews.
It's actually funny because I think in Australia, like, everything is trying to kill you in the outside. At least that's the meme, right? But what you say there about like nature, very much nature-based solutions, and I remember this from my class back in the day. We were talking about these ecosystem builders and working, for example, like planting more mangroves to make sure that there's less erosion and protection for storms. But like you said, I think those are all very much nature-based solutions, which are very context specific. What we can use here in Belgium is not going to be the same that you can use in Australia or in Texas. What are some approaches that are important there, especially when you're working with people who might not understand the scientific nuances when it comes to that?
I think that's a great observation, because we are increasingly seeing global discussion on ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions. And it seems to be every donor goes, mangroves, let's plant more mangroves. And we're like, but some places do not have mangroves. And we've seen cases where they have planted mangroves because that's what you do. And they planted mangroves in ecosystems that don't have mangroves. And so the actual ecosystem changes, and sometimes quite abruptly. So I think it's always, when we talk about adaptation, it's always, and especially with Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a lot of the, what we look at, it is this kind of big trend. So what strategies overall could work for climate adaptation? But then also always bearing in mind that we have to look at the kind of, what's on the ground first and try to understand, well, what is the problem? Because I think people have very different perceptions what a problem is. And I was reading this book on communication, and they said, don't bring problems to people. Like every person has 99 problems. And so when you talk about climate change and you talk about how bad it is and what a big problem it is, a lot of the times people go, well, that's now I have 100 problems. It's like, how do we talk about climate adaptation in a way that is empowering and that is, that there are solutions, but that we need to have that conversation now. But I think a lot of the public discourse has been quite discouraging often. And it is very much has been, especially on the emission side, it has been very much blaming the individual. Like, you are doing bad things, you should stop. Whereas then we don't kind of look at corporations. We don't look at, the fossil fuel lobby. We don't look at the actual interest groups that are doing a lot of this behind the scenes, but we then, really focus on the individual. And I think that has been one of the big fallacies. Like individual action has obviously impacts, but I think sometimes we misplace our understanding where the biggest kind of, points of change are.
I mean, I got a lot of questions. I got a lot of thoughts on this. I've thought about this, and I've sort of shaped my work, I think, around this topic and specifically this sort of line of discussion. But it seems like everything is pointing to the fact that our current civilization is just unsustainable. And we're used to it, which is the scary thing. We're used to just being able to fill a car up with gas in 5 minutes and drive down the road and hop on an airplane and fly across the world and get, things in plastic packaging and, order something from China and it shows up at your doorstep. And I worry that's not going to be the future. And I don't necessarily worry because it's convenient and I don't want to lose the convenience, but I feel like as a society, people are going to try and cling to that for as long as possible. To me, part of climate adaptation is learning to kind of slow down. Like, is that reasonable? Is that, I mean, from what you've seen, what are your thoughts?
I really like that. The adaptation is about slowing down, because I often think about adaptation as a chance to rethink. And you know, what are the futures like? And one of the initiatives where I'm in the advisory group is Resilience Frontiers. That's United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's one of their initiatives, and that's all about rethinking what does the world look like, you know, in the future, and what are the changes that we can make across, you know, different sectors and different ways of thinking. And I think being involved with that initiative always gives me hope, because it is about seeing the world in a different way. And one of my really good friends said to me, is climate action really about action, or is it about changing the way people perceive the world and think what's possible? And that always, to me, is adaptation. To me, is about global imagination. Like, how do we introduce new ideas that are actually positive? That, you know, so often we talk about the future, but a lot of the times we can't articulate what a thriving future looks like. We just say, you know, we need these policy processes, we need these changes, but we don't talk about the big vision, like what is going to happen once we do these things. And I think there is such a power with, like, film, for instance. There's such a power in film, changing how people feel in that moment, opening their kind of minds to new ideas. So I think there's so many leverage points that we should be looking at, rather than going, oh, the change is only going to come from individuals. No, the change is only going to come from NGOs, or the change is only coming from the private sector. I think that we have to kind of think about kind of layered possibilities for change, but also, like, I'm more and more passionate about the role of imagination in you know, in what we do, but also how we can drive action, but also help other people to understand, well, what would that world look like if we change the way that we did things? And a lot of the times those images can be like really positive, and people go, well, yes, that's, oh my God, like that is the future that we want. But often we kind of, like I said, we start from the problem basis and say, there's this massive problem, it's a global problem. And then we say, oh, countries are not doing enough. And I think it's quite often disempowering, but like we do need the pressure groups, you know, we do need the NGOs, the activists being vocal, for instance, at the negotiations, and really calling out the rhetoric that, you know, there is around climate change, and they're saying, oh, we are doing all these great things and, you know, investing so much in renewables. But then when you look at the investments in fossil fuels, you know, yes, we are investing in renewables, but at the same time, you know, the fossil fuel investments are also going up. So I think it's a complex issue, but I feel like there are so many good people out there who are trying to make a difference through different platforms and mediums.